It was a bright winter day in December of 2020 when communications specialist and filmmaker Eileen Park-Robertson and former mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Robertson, said, "I do." It was a magical day filled with love and new beginnings that was captured and celebrated on the pages of Vogue magazine. Soon after the article was published, Eileen was bombarded with an onslaught of anti-Asian hate-filled messages, reprehensible sexual comments, and other racialized slurs. In the past, Eileen dealt with these types of attacks by not responding, not wanting to fuel the fire, but this time was different. Less than 48 hours after the article came out on March 16th of 2021, a mass shooting transpired in 3 spas in Atlanta, Georgia. 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women. Eileen could no longer remain silent.
There's blatant hate like that.
She took to social media with a 9-minute video to speak out against anti-Asian hate and the hyper-sexualized trope she and other Asian women have had to live with their whole lives. What happened to Eileen this year and the continued anti-Asian hate crimes, especially against women, propels us to explore deeper, to try to unpack where these tropes come from and what to do about it. Joining us in this conversation today is Eileen herself, along with experts Celine, Parreñas, Shimizu, and Kimberley, Wong. Welcome to Cityline, all of you, and thank you for joining this conversation. It's not easy to talk about, but we need to be speaking about these things. So, Eileen, can you tell us about what happened after the article in Vogue came out and why the timing was so significant?
You know, it's incredibly significant. We are currently in the midst of a long overdue reckoning when it comes to acknowledging the historical and current oppression Asian communities face around the world. And the Stop Asian Hate movement we're in right now, I would say, really gained prominence and power because our Indigenous, Black, and communities of color came together after seeing Asian grandmothers and grandfathers, mothers and sisters physically attacked over and over again. And Atlanta was the turning point. And as you mentioned, just 36 hours after 8 people were killed in Atlanta, 6 of them Asian women, because of a man with the sexual addiction to Asian women, news of my interracial marriage broke. And the volume of the racist hate that flooded my inbox and DMs almost broke me. The vast majority of the messages being related to the racist fetishization of who I am as an Asian woman. So with reluctance, I spoke out because I could not stand to spend another moment allowing the largely unchallenged racist attitudes about Asian women to continue.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what it would feel like to be targeted in such a deplorable way, especially after an event as joyful as your wedding. So thank you for speaking out. It's not easy, and for sharing your story with us. Celine, I'm going to go to you now. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of these dehumanizing tropes that Asian women face and how they're rooted in history.
Historically, the law and popular culture worked together to define Asian women's sexuality as essentially one they didn't own. So the rise of global mass culture in the late 1800s in plays that circulated widely, like Madame Chrysanthemum, Madame Butterfly, The Good Woman in Szechuan, presented this servile, suffering, self-sacrificing Asian woman who loved the white man so much that she would give up her own child to prove that love. She would devote herself to him and eventually kill herself when he would not reciprocate that love. So it's a kind of frightening devotion that simply can't be attributed to, eros or love for someone else, but really a powerful death drive that turns in against itself. At the same time, U.S. immigration law, you can see this in the Page Act of 1875, which barred Asian women's entry, particularly because of this perception of hypersexuality. I think what's also really fascinating is that the very creation of the passport photo, was part of this regulation of the mobility of particular women who were thought of as prostitutes, wherein supposedly their moral activity was evident on their faces. So, Western music, theater, and film in the late 19th century featured figures like the China doll, the geisha girl. And essentially they were white women in yellow face. And so Asian women experience this gendered racism and representations of sexuality that showed up on stage and screen, as well as the scenes of everyday life.
Thank you for that. Kimberley, can you speak to some of the racist stereotypes that continue to pervade Asians and Asian women within a Canadian context?
First, I think it's that there is a greater literacy in the United States, for example, on race, and perhaps it's the greater willingness to discuss it because it is so easily categorized into things like black and white, Democrat versus Republican, these binary good and evil things. But the policies that Celine, for example, spoke about that people of color were oppressed by in the United States, we had those here too. In Canada, we had the Chinese head tax put in place to restrict migration from Asia. And this was directly after the Canadian Pacific Railway was built by Cantonese men who did the most dangerous jobs for the lowest wages, things like blowing through mountain with dynamite, men from the Punjab region of India working in sawmills, which also displaced and dispossessed Indigenous people from the land, only to have the children they put in residential schools to strip them of their culture, personhood, and families. In the 1940s, after Japanese Canadians were dispossessed from their land, put into internment camps beyond the Rocky Mountains, there were posters up that encouraged assimilation through marriage, as in the best way to strip a culture of its traditions, its existence, is to get women of that race to have children with white men. So these stereotypes, these descriptors, these depictions of us become what people see as the truth. And as we've seen, this translates to very real, very scary actions that often result in physical harm and in some cases can escalate to things like genocide.
There's so much to unpack, and I understand being in a situation where you don't necessarily want to fight all of that. And Eileen, that was you. If you could just walk us through what you were thinking in your mind when you didn't want to speak out, and then why all of a sudden you had to speak out, I think it would be helpful.
Behavior and racist attitudes continue when they're not challenged. And we are challenging behavior and beliefs that have not been exposed or confronted in a very long time.
My last question is just going to be, how do we do better? And by we, I don't necessarily mean you three. I mean, how does the world do better? Like, how do we get out of this situation where these stereotypes are perpetuated and harm is being caused? And Kimberley, I'll give this one to you.
I think being able to tell our own stories, being able to learn about our own histories is powerful, and being able to educate others on these things is also an important part of this. Mm-hmm. And this can empower us to challenge these narratives, these microaggressions, these stereotypes in our homes, in our relationships, in our workplaces, and eventually speak up on this on a systemic level. We can't just stop at ending Asian hate. When we are calling for the end of anti-Asian racism, we must consider who is and who is not currently protected under our definitions of Asian. Are we speaking up in support of Southeast Asian women who are overrepresented in service and frontline industries? Are we speaking up in support of sex workers whose livelihoods are under constant threat of violence? Are we speaking up in support of Black and Brown Asian bodies in the face of colorism within our community? Because we can't just stop at representation or education. We need to ensure that this speaking out translates to equity and justice in practice for those most affected.
Kimberley, well said. And I appreciate all of you coming in and sharing your stories and, even potential solutions for where we can go from here, for the next few years and into the future. So Celine, Kimberley, and Eileen, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this complex and heavy issue. We're going to keep chipping away at it here on Cityline. This is, sort of just us dipping our foot into the topic, but we appreciate